Hey, we've had a long weekend, kids, and I got Monarchs and the Tragically Hip and Van Halen on my mind. And something called the Blindboy. And I'll tell you all about it on the other side. Hello, you're listening to the John Huff Podcast. Oh, yay. Hey, why do we celebrate Victoria Day anyhow? That question was put to me just this morning. It's Manic Monday, kids. For a lot of you out there, it is in fact Victoria Day weekend, and in Canada, most of Canada, I think all of Canada, we take ourselves a long weekend, kids, for Victoria Day. And so this morning, over a leisurely coffee, French pressed, kids never overlook quality coffee, all right? Now, it's very important that you put the effort into your morning coffee. Don't futz about with your drip machine. Get yourself a French press, get yourself a pour over, grind those beans, kids. Ritualize that like the Japanese tea ceremony, okay? Make yourself good coffee, all right? And make it with cold water. There's an art to coffee, man. Grind those beans, boil your cold water. Then you pour it into the grounds, just a little bit, just to get them kind of activated. Give them like 20 seconds. Then you slowly pour the rest of the water in, man. You fill that sucker up. Just a little bit of a stir with a spoon, wooden spoon, or a chopstick, Just a little agitation. Get it to open up, Then you leave it for exactly 4 minutes, right? Then you plunge slowly down, and you got yourself a nice, round, could be strong, but still mellow cup of coffee, man. None of this bitterness, none of this harsh stuff. Care enough about yourself, care enough about your day to take your morning coffee seriously, all right? This is one of the great things about Europe, all right? Because in Europe, they do a bunch of things really, really freaking well. And one of those things is coffee, man. So you pull over off the Autobahn, right, onto a gas station in Deutschland, right? And you walk in and you go to the coffee machine and you put in your euros. And if you're in North America and you're going to the coffee machine at the gas station, why waste your time, man? Why bother? It's going to be terrible. In fact, you go to most coffee shops, it's going to be terrible, all right? I mean the chain places. In Europe, Deutschland, Netherlands, wherever, you pull over into the gas station, you put your euros into the little coffee machine, you select what you want from the array of options available, and what you're going to get's a nice cup of coffee, kids. Take yourself seriously enough. You gotta love yourself, kids, and preparing good coffee is part of that, all right? In Europe, they do it right. So you get up at your hotel and you have your continental breakfast with your meat and bread and cheese. And you'll have a nice cup, man. Wherever you go, you'll get yourself a nice cup. You wake up at the Super 8, pour that coffee. Not so good, man, but they will have hotel waffles. And that in some degree, in some manner, to some level, compensates for the horrendous coffee, all right? So we're having coffee this morning, Victoria Day. Day off, Monday. My wife says, why do we have a Victoria Day? Why do we celebrate Victoria Day? And the answer to that question, kids, is we don't. We don't anymore, all right? Now, we have a holiday the last Monday in May every year, and we call it Victoria Day, But the truth is, over time, it has morphed into something else. It's officially called Victoria Day, but we all know, sea to shining sea, coast to coast, that it's May 2-4 weekend, okay? This is May 2-4 weekend, and we do not celebrate the heretofore longest reigning monarch in British history. We celebrate camping. We celebrate camping, and we celebrate one of those great other national Canadian pastimes, which is complaining about the weather. Say what you like about hockey, and it's a cool convergence, right? May 2-4 weekend is a cool convergence in the typical calendar year for Canadians, because we have May 2-4 weekend where we celebrate the Canadian pastime of complaining about the weather and camping. And the hockey playoffs are in full swing, right? So you get these two great Canadian things happening. Hockey playoffs and camping. And complaining about the weather, because the weather on May 2-4 weekend is notoriously horrendous, okay? So people will book their campsite when you could do that. You know, coronavirus has changed that for this year and last year. People book their campsite and they get ready and they bundle up all their wieners and stuff. And their 2-4s, right? For those of you, I don't know what it's like in the rest of the world, but you buy yourself a 2-4, a 24 can or bottle of beer package, however that works. You know, you get yourself a 2-4 for the weekend, or 3 or 4 of them. And you get ready to go to your campsite, and for 2 weeks before May 2-4 weekend, the weather is gorgeous. So it's like 22 degrees, you know, it's beautiful, it's sunny, it's nice, and you're like, yeah, man, May 2-4, we're going camping. And then on the Friday of that weekend, you get yourself up, and you go out to the car, and you're all packed, and you're ready to go, and it's snowing outside. Or it's like 3 degrees above zero, and there's like a drizzle. And for the most part, you spend May 2-4 weekend, if you make it to your campsite, freezing, you know, ice fishing in May. And it's awful, and people tell horrendous stories of how lousy the weather was on May 2-4 weekend again. And that is the national pastime, all right? Then you add in the hockey playoffs with that, you get yourself a real weekend of Canadiana, my friends. Why, if you were just camping in a sugar bush with beavers all around you, that's as Canadian as it gets. And a moose dressed up like a Mountie. May 2-4 weekend's been great this year. A fabulous, I cannot remember a better weather weekend on May 2-4 weekend than we've had this year. And so the splendor of Victoria shines around us. Now the thing is, we don't celebrate Victoria Day anymore. It's called that. We don't celebrate that. But go back 160, 170 years, and people celebrated Victoria Day, man. Back in those days, people cared about their monarch. Now, call me a revolutionary, kids, but I have a serious issue with Canada having a monarch at all. Not a monarchist, not sure why the basically powerless sovereign of a foreign country is on my money, but I ain't going to get into that here today, all right? We had Vimy Ridge, we spilled our blood, you know, for king and empire. We're free now, all right? And of course, Canada is its own constitutional government. You know, we have our own constitution, kids. We are a separate nation. But for some reason, the queen is still the queen. But you go back 160, 170 years ago, let's say 1840s, 1845, you have on the throne of England, Victoria. And at that point in time, she's like early 20s, you know, and she reigns for 63 years, kids. 1837, she's 18 years old. She ascends to the throne of England, and she reigns for 63 years over the high water mark, the peak of the British Empire, all right? The sun never sets on the British Empire and the Great Royal Navy and all that stuff. And all the awful stuff that came with it, by the way. That's Victoria. That's the Victorian age. And if you go back to what would become Canada in the 1840s, what you find is amongst the European immigrants to this great land, don't want to get into that either, a high percentage of English people, UK people, right? British Isles, right? And so they come here and they still identify themselves as British Empire. And Canada was not even a country at that point, 1840s, right? We are a colony. And so we have a much more direct, distinct, absolute tie to the monarchy. People cared about the Queen in those days, all right? And so her birthday was in late May, and so Canada adopted Victoria Day to celebrate our Queen. And it was a big freaking deal, man. Like thousands of people would turn up in the park to celebrate, or they'd stand in front of what constituted a government building in their town and sing praises to Victoria, man. Big deal, big holiday, all right? And this predates Confederation, the founding of Canada as a nation, by over 20 years, all right? We're talking 1867 there, and it is no coincidence that the Confederation of the Canadian colonies into one political entity in 1867, followed by about 2 years, the end of the American Civil War, 1865, when the powers that be in what would become Canada looked down across the border and saw, our neighbors to the south just ended their civil war, and what it's left is a nation in ruins, but with probably the largest, most well-equipped, and certainly most battle-hardened military on planet Earth. Maybe we ought to get organized up here, okay? Because at that point in time, some mostly drunken Irishmen, Fenians, had been sneaking across the border and stealing chickens and stuff. So we thought the Fenians are an issue. The Americans have like a 1 million-strong army down there that's been shooting people for 4 or 5 years. Maybe we should get organized, right? So Canada, Confederation 1867 followed very hard upon that. Anyways, people liked the monarchy back then, and Canada very much was identified as a British colony, particularly in opposition in relation to the United States. That separateness begins kind of there, the American Revolution happened and they split off from England, late 1700s, and Canada did not. Canada remained the operating zone, the operational zone for the British military, man. So we had the Battle of Queenston Heights, and we had Lundy's Lane, and we had all this fun stuff you can see when you go to the Niagara region. Anyways, Canada loved the monarch, all right? And that's why we have Victoria Day, and that's just become a tradition over time. Once you give the people a day off, hard to get that day off back, kids, you know what I mean? So Canadians used to come out in the thousands to celebrate Victoria Day. And we still do it, but we don't care so much about Victoria now. We have the great Queen Elizabeth II, who's reigned for, I was figuring this out today, it's like 70 years almost. Queen Elizabeth, it was 1952 or something like that, when Queen Elizabeth became queen. So we've had this kind of kicking around, but we don't have really Elizabeth's birthday that we worry about too much. And we don't worry about Victoria either. We celebrate camping and bad weather on May 2-4 weekend. And how appropriate is it, kids? How necessary and how vital and how apropos that as we celebrate camping weekend, May 2-4 weekend this year, 2021, in the throes of continuing pandemic lockdowns, some of us only barely holding it together, that in the week that happens, that quintessential, that most Canadian of rock bands, the Tragically Hip, releases an unexpected EP. And how much auditory sonic comfort food is there in a new Tragically Hip release right here on the edge of summer? How many summers, kids, over the past 30 years or more have been spent in our fragile Canadian sunshine listening to the new Tragically Hip record? Warms your cockles, kids, just a little bit. And I'm a bad Canadian, all right? Because I've never seen the Tragically Hip live. Amazing, right? I like the hip and I appreciate the hip and all that. And there's a long list of like 50 Tragically Hip songs that I've never owned that I can sing word for word. They've been on the radio that freaking much, man. And I was thinking just today that I would like to see a Tragically Hip SoCan check. For those of you who don't know, royalties in Canada, radio, television, performance royalties, are collected and distributed by an organization called SoCan, all right? And some of you out there, of course, are SoCan members. I know a lot of you are musicians, and you've probably received the kind of SoCan checks that I have. $1.04, I think, was maybe the big one. And you get one for 17 cents, and I had one, I think it was 9 cents. Quite literally not worth the paper it was printed on, SoCan. You've probably had those checks too, all right? Now, Hiroshima Hearts, when I was a member, not a huge radio band, okay? We got a little. Now, I know for a fact that we were played at least once, possibly twice, on the commercial mainstream rock station in Regina, Saskatchewan. Not campus radio. Most of our radio play has been campus, all right? And that is not unique to us. That's most indie bands. Very, very difficult, kids, as an indie band to get your tune on mainstream commercial radio, all right? But we got picked up in Regina, and we probably should have done a world tour of Regina 5 or 6 years ago when our Bone Music EP came out, and I've talked about that before. We got a little bit of London, Ontario radio play, thank you to Free FM 98.1. Not a lot of royalties in that, but we did get a fair amount of campus play. And what happens in the university circuit here, at least it used to, it probably still does, is you take 50 copies of your CD and you take it up to the campus radio station, right? And you give them $50 and they will distribute your CD across the country to other campus stations. And so you do that because, hey, $50, man, and you send your CDs out across the land. And then every now and again you go and you check the campus radio charts or you check the indie radio charts across the country and you'll find that you're charting. So Hiroshima Hearts was like a top 10 band somewhere in Alberta for a while. Canmore or someplace. And on the East Coast, you know, all the kids were swinging to the Bone Music EP out there. You know, pretty cool. One time, we're driving around and we turned on the local campus station, which I am wont to do, especially when they used to play a lot more local music. And we heard our song 4 Steps Down being played. There's a video for that tune. It was shot in an old church. It's very creepy. Morgan Lander from Kitty makes a cameo in that, and one of our other videos, by the way. And we heard 4 Steps, and we're like, oh, let's listen to that. It's weird hearing yourself on the radio. I've had that privilege, and it's cool, but it's also kind of weird. But you listen when you hear it, because, you know, especially as an indie band, you don't get that too much. So they're playing 4 Steps Down, the song comes to an end. Hey, that was terrific. Then it plays again. That song begins with just like a guitar riff, and the song begins again. We're like, uh-oh. And it plays all the way through. Then the song plays again. It plays all the way through. Then the song plays again. Something was going on in the control room at the radio station, man. I don't know if somebody split, went for a cigarette day, and like hit repeat by accident or something. But it played 4 Steps Down like 8 times in a row. And one of two things is going to happen if they play your song on the radio 8 times in a row. People are going to tune in and think it's funny that this is happening and really get to love that song, get it drilled into their head, and it is a catchy number. Or they're going to hate that freaking song and they're going to hate your freaking band. But it's campus radio, so I don't know how many people are listening. Obviously not enough for somebody to call in and say, dude, play a different song. So Hearts had just enough radio play for me to get SoCan checks for 9 cents. Now, the Tragically Hip are played on every rock and every classic rock station in the country multiple times a day. And I would like to see one of those SoCan checks. Now, it depends. It depends on how they weighed the points, all right? When you register your song for SoCan, you can give percentages of the royalties based on songwriting credits, etc., etc., etc. I don't know how the Hip did that. Hearts, it was just all equal. When you're dealing with 9 cents, not that big a deal, all right? But when you're the Hip and your song's getting played 1,000 times a day, or various songs in combination, 1,000 or more probably, all across this great nation, that's a substantial amount of royalties, man. And if you've got things set up so that certain people get a bigger cut of the royalties, you know, your lyricist, or if you have like a main songwriter in your band, if you're one of those bands where like one guy writes everything, chances are pretty good that that one guy's getting all the royalties, man, or he's getting like 85. And then the other 3 or 4 guys in the band are splitting 15. And this, when you start getting into those kinds of numbers, when we're talking thousands or hundreds of thousands here, that will cause a problem in your band, my friends. It caused a problem in Van Halen. Van Halen cut Michael Anthony right out of it towards the end, man. And Michael Anthony, who's such a good guy and such a company man, went along with it, but they jerked him around pretty hard, kids. Read Noel Monk's book. And I'm thinking of Sebastian Bach of Skid Row, who continues 30 years later to fight with Skid Row over royalties, because Sebastian Bach may not have written the songs, might not have written 18 in Life, but there are vocal lines in that tune and screams and stuff that were Sebastian's invention, Sebastian's contribution, for which he thinks he ought to get songwriting royalties. And the people who wrote the songs are like, I don't think so, boss. And this causes a lot of consternation, kids. A lot of bands break up over royalties percentages, especially if they blow up and those royalties percentages begin to get into the hundreds of thousands or even the millions, man. Causes some jealousies, causes some territorial stuff, you know? Separates band members. If you got 1 or 2 songwriters who feel like they're pulling the load and pulling the rest of those guys with them, you know, it creates dissension. It creates camps within the band. And a band divided against itself cannot stand. Look at Van Halen. So the Hip released Saskadelphia. And what is Saskadelphia? That is an EP of stuff, songs that were left on the cutting room floor of, I think, the Road Apples record, okay? Now, when they released that record back in the 90s, that was intended to be a double record, right? And it didn't work out that way. They only wound up releasing half of it as a full length on Road Apples. And they intended to call the Road Apples album Saskadelphia, all right? This is the Tragically Hip. This is the quintessential Canadian band writing about Canadian themes, Canadian stories, Canadian places, man. Connected to an American label. So the label comes along and says, Saskadelphia. Dude, nobody down here is going to know what you're talking about, man. We're not calling it Saskadelphia. That's way too Canadian. This is early on in the Hip's career, all right? They're popular, but I don't think they're going to become the Canadian icons just yet. This album's probably going to help with that a lot. Tragically Hip's not very happy about having their title taken away by that US label. So they renamed the album Road Apples. And what is a road apple, kids? Road apple is a horse puck. It's droppings left by horses on the road. Road apples. So a little dig there from the band, a little tongue-in-cheek, you know. We're going to give you a worse title than Saskadelphia. There's a bunch of tunes recorded for the other side of that double record that never got released, all right? And it was thought when there was a massive fire on the Universal parking lot, wherever they stored the Universal archives, there was a massive fire back around 2008, something like that. And it was thought that amongst the treasure trove of stuff lost by like 100 major artists in those archives were the tapes from those Road Apples sessions, all right? Turns out, many years later, the band is sifting through the archives and they find out that those Road Apples sessions were not lost. They were in fact transported back to Canada in the early 2000s and therefore escaped the big fire. So they like, hey, we got these songs. They're, fully produced, fully recorded. There's 4 of them, I think, 5 of them, and then a live song that they picked up in Montreal. Let's release this thing as Saskadelphia at long, long last. And of course, we know that Gord Downie died a few years ago, brain cancer, and that was a national thing. I've never seen the Hip live in person, although I did go down to the box office when that tour, that final farewell Hip tour, hit my city. I went down to the box office to see if I could get, game day tickets, and they had some, but they were in this section kind of behind the stage and way up high. And then for me, it would have been kind of fun to be able to see Johnny Faye playing drums from the back, but I don't know what the vantage point would have been. And the ticket prices were somewhat prohibitive, all right? So I didn't wind up going to that show. I did watch the final event, as did 1 out of 3 Canadians, all right? Tragically Hip, back in their hometown of Kingston, Ontario, play the K-Rock Centre, which is the local hockey arena. The final farewell Tragically Hip show. Now, I watched that, as did 1/3 of Canadians. There are like 11 million people tuned in to watch the final Tragically Hip show. That was a national event, my friends. Even if you're not a Hip fan, chances are the guy standing beside you is. And it's weird when bands break up, man. Like, you can have a band on a farewell tour because they're calling it quits after 40 years of playing or whatever. And the fans come out and that's like a celebration and a farewell. We'll see ya. This was not that. This was the band is the ultimate iconic Canadiana band. And we're doing this farewell tour because the guy is going to die. This is terminal. So it was like a succession of funerals almost in a way. Celebrations of life, but legit, Gord's going to die. He's a Canadian hero to us. He's part of the Canadian fabric. Gord freaking Downie, man. And he's wearing those hats to kind of cover over the scars on his head from the procedures that have been going on. It was a national kind of period of mourning, but I watched that final show, this giant stage at the K-Rock Centre, and the Tragically Hip kind of huddled in a tight little ball in the middle of the stage. Gord struggling to get through some of the lyrics, struggling with his memory at that point. This is terminal brain cancer, kids. It's going to mess with you. And that was a moment in Canadian history in some ways. It's very, very sad. And I'm not a great Canadian because I never saw them live apart from that, But isn't it time now? Isn't now the right time with so many people struggling, with so many people having trouble with their mental health, with so many people across the country to just put on a new Tragically Hip record? Think of the old days. Think of the way it used to be. Warm their cockles, have those memories of whenever they would go and see the Hip every summer. Another roadside attraction or whenever the Hip were touring. It was weird to be the Hip, I think. Massive in Canada. Absolutely huge Canadian band. As big as it gets. But mostly just in Canada and a couple of border towns where they could get Canadian radio. And so you would tour across Canada playing arenas, right? 5,000 people, 10,000 people, 15, depends on the city, depends on the room. Or like big festivals, you take roadside attraction across the country, but you can do a major Canadian tour and hit all the big hotspots in 3 weeks, man. You can do it in 3 weeks. And then what? Like, what do? You can't really just keep crisscrossing back and forth across the country. Maybe you can a couple times a year, talking 6 weeks, 2 months of your life. And you can make some pretty good bank on those trips, but what about the rest of the time? And the hip never really broke in the States. They did okay in the States. Like, they had moments, like they toured with The Who down there. And they'd go down and they'd play clubs, and they'd do well in those clubs and they have their little pockets of fans. But it was not the same as here, And it's just kind of a weird existence that band had. And I liked the band. I was not immersed the way a lot of people were. But what you get if you're looking for nostalgia, if you're looking to feel the way it used to be even before a year ago, and certainly before Gord Downie passed away, it's nice to hear quote-unquote new hip music, which is not new at all. This is stuff from the Road Apple sessions, and I'd tell you about the record what you already know about the record, okay? It sounds just like the Tragically Hip sounded in the early 90s. It sounds like the hip. It's a hip record. There are cool songs. Go listen to Ouch. Go listen to Not Necessary. Go listen to Reformed Baptist Blues. And it's the hip, and that's the greatest thing about it. I was never the most giant hip fan. But if you were, and you missed those days, and you want to just throw it back kind of existentially, if you want to feel it like it used to be, go listen to the Saskadelphia EP. It's new hip that's old hip, and it's just what you need, man. It is comfort food extraordinaire at a time when a lot of Canadians need it most. All right, we got to talk about it again, kids. This is the topic that will not go away. The topic du jour, the topic d'année. Topic d'année, does that make sense? The topic of the year? Yes, I was contacted last week by our old friend Elena, probably looking for another show shout out. And she says to me, get this, kids, hold on to your hats. She says, who is better, David Lee Roth or Sammy Hagar? And I'm like, what? Have you listened to my show, dude? We've gone over this. She's like, no, I want to know why. What? You're like 20. You're like 19 or something. What are you asking me this for? But I feel a certain, sense of obligation to the younger generation, to the kids, because a lot of the music is garbage these days, kids. We gotta make sure we are nurturing an interest in rock and roll amongst the kids, all right? So if one of them comes to me and wants to talk again about Van Halen versus Van Hagar, I feel duty-bound as an elder, to indulge that. So here we go again with Dave versus Sammy. So what I thought I would do is a bit of diligence, all right? Now, I've been through this. Go back to the Triumphant Return episode, like 48. Go back to 49. I think we talked about Dave versus Sammy. And here's what I did, all right? I thought, we'll do some diligence. I will pay more attention to Sammy. So last weekend, I sit down in front of the big TV, the big smart TV that gives me YouTube at the press of a button. And I says, let's watch Sammy play with Van Halen, okay? So I chose 1989. I figure that's representative, right? They got a few records out as Van Hagar. Sammy's bedded in at this point. This is probably peak Van Hagar. And I got Van Halen live in Japan, 1989. It's like an hour and a half show, something like that. Going to play all the Sammy hits, right? This is going to be, by that point, they've accumulated enough Sammy material that they don't have to do the old stuff. And this is going to be the real band. And here's what I thought, kids, as I'm watching this. I thought, you know what? This is pretty great. And it is. It is pretty great. Sammy's singing great. Sammy Hagar has a great voice. Nobody ever said Sammy doesn't have a great voice. Great singer, and he's nailing it, and he's super pro, and he's hitting everything. And Sammy's a way, way better guitar player than I thought. And that's cool, man. That adds a wrinkle to the band because you got Eddie playing so many keyboards, especially in the Sammy era. And Sammy's playing the guitar, man, so he's filling all that in. We don't need tracks. We don't need to hire a guy. Sammy's got you covered, all right? Sammy's a great guitar player, and you got he and Eddie trading solos and playing like guitarmonies together. Pretty cool, man. It was a really good show, and there's a lot of really good songs, all right? And I liked it. I enjoyed it. And I could watch Eddie Van Halen play guitar just for hours on end. As I've said before, I am fascinated by the guitar players, man. I go to the King's X show, I stand in front of Ty Tabor, and I just am mesmerized. I'm amazed by guitar players. And, you know, if you're going to be amazed by a guitar player, Eddie Van Halen's not a bad place to start, you know? So I'm watching Eddie, I'm watching the band, they're killing it. Michael Anthony's backup vocals, are you kidding me? And they railroaded that dude hard at the end, man. But Michael Anthony, wow, like he's hitting notes that only dogs can hear. Dogs and Mariah Carey's vocal tracks, you know what I mean? And it's a great freaking show, all right? So I watched that and it's like, that was cool. That was awesome. That was peak Van Hagar. Very, very cool. So I'm like, all right, dare to compare, kids. Let's play the game. So I'm sifting through the YouTube and I'm like, let's find peak Roth, okay? And that for me is going to be the 1984 tour, right? You know, they've been together for a long time. They've done all the classic stuff. And I want to hear the stuff from 1984, so let's do that. And so what do we find? Van Halen live in Montreal, 1984, man. Playing the Forum in Montreal. Hockey's Jerusalem, kids. The greatest venue the sport has ever known. Where more championship banners were hung than will ever be hung anywhere else. And I say that now because I have serious doubts about whether there will ever be another one. So we got Van Halen on the 1984 tour playing in Montreal, and it is kind of all over the place, right? Like the tempos are super fast, so fast in some cases that they're actually killing the groove of the song. And it's a bit slapdash and it's a bit haphazard, and it's Dave doing Dave, right? And he's singing some of the lyrics and he's shouting some of the other ones, you know? And he's kind of there and he's kind of not. And he's David Lee Roth, man. It is sloppy. It is haphazard. It's all over the place. Tempos are weird. Everything's kind of upside down. And you know what? Absolutely no comparison, man. Absolutely no comparison. There is a vitality and an energy and a swagger and a charisma and an attitude in that 1984 Van Halen that the much more polished 1989 just does not match. And if you give me the option, you say to me, I got a plane ticket for you, baby, astral travel. You can go back to 1989, you can go back to 1984, take your pick. I'm going to 1984 10 times out of 10, kids. Because yeah, Dave's sort of invested in singing and sort of not. But you know, when the show starts, the band starts playing and there's a bit of like darkness on the stage, but the band is going, and then like the lights bang up and David Lee Roth jumps off the drum riser, the full splits like he does, and the place goes berserk. The place is there in part to see David Lee Roth, man, to see the singer of Van Halen. You know, people talk about how Eddie is the genius. I put this to my pal Pete. Pete, one of my oldest friends of all time, who once sucker punched me, by the way, and I still owe him a receipt for that. I put it to Pete because Pete's the biggest Van Halen fan I know, and I'm like, dude, what's your perspective as an insider? Dave versus Sammy. And Pete was non-committal about that. He recognized Eddie as the true genius and everybody else kind of revolving around Planet Eddie, but I take a little bit of issue with that. Because when you look at Van Halen 1984, it's not just Planet Eddie. There is the gravitational force of David Lee Roth that does not exist in the Sammy show, all right? Sammy's great. Great singer, great player. David Lee Roth is an entity. So my conclusion about it was Van Halen, 1989, Sammy Hagar, a freaking phenomenal rock band. You watch them play and you're like, that is a great rock band. Van Halen, 1984, David Lee Roth is an iconic rock band. You look at those guys play and you're like, that is legend. Dave's doing his high kicks. He's got a sword at one point and he's doing all the kung fu stuff. David Lee Roth is one of the great frontmen of all time. And that's why I don't like to give Sammy any stick, okay? Because he had one of the hardest jobs that a rock and roll performer has ever had to do. That dude had to replace David Lee Roth. And it's not just about Roth being Roth, all right? He had to walk into a band that had already had a career, okay? This is not Bruce Dickinson replacing Paul Di'Anno and Iron Maiden. Now, I know Iron Maiden was a thing with Paul fronting them, but they had not become Iron Maiden, also an iconic band, at that point in time. That happened with Bruce Dickinson. Sammy's walking in to a band that's already iconic, and partly iconic because of the guy he's replacing. Sammy Hagar's walking into people's favorite band to replace the singer and an entity and a character in their favorite band. That ain't easy to do, man. And Sammy did it great. And there's a reason, I think, why the sound of the band changed at that point. They needed to break with that. Partly, I think, for Sammy's benefit. You know? Look, let's start something that's new and fresh and sounds different here. So poor freaking Sammy has already got to live with that legacy. Let's give the dude a break, man. Let's write some songs that are tuned to Sammy. Let's write with Sammy, you know? And it becomes a new thing. But for me, it's a great rock band versus an iconic rock band. And the iconic part of that owes so much to David Lee Roth. People are going to argue with me. People continue to argue with me, and that's okay, man. This isn't Russia. Is this Russia? This isn't Russia. You can have your own opinions. For me, Van Halen, iconic. Van Hagar, really, really great. All right, kids, it's Holiday Monday. I got stuff to do. I am a landowner, and I gotta water my grass. You know, I got a responsibility to the neighborhood, as Sam Kinison once said. But I want to give you some stuff, all right? It's my game here to point you at other people. And if you're a podcast fan, I want to point you to the Blindboy Podcast, all right? Now, I discovered this recently. Once in a while, I kind of spin around the internet looking for shows kind of like mine. And when I say kind of like mine, what I mostly mean is solo shows, right? One host, one microphone. I do that for two reasons, all right? One, I like those shows. Those are the shows I listen to. So if there's a good one out there, I want to know about it so I can check it out. And B, if there's a good one out there, I want to know what they're doing that's good. And I'm not exactly stealing from that. I'm trying to learn, all right? Because I am trying to turn this show into a thing. You know, I'm still trying to do that. So once in a while, I spin around and I'm like, what are the solo shows that people are listening to and why? And the Blindboy Podcast came up in the listings. A lot of people are talking about this. It is an enormously popular thing. So the Blindboy Podcast is run by Blindboy. Who is Blindboy? Well, he is a writer, fiction writer, and a TV presenter and a TV writer, and he's done a lot of TV and film stuff, and he's one half of the Rubber Bandits, which is kind of a music/comedy thing, very, very popular in many parts of the world. Dude has a following, and he always wears a bag on his head. Interesting cat, the Blindboy, but one of the things that the Blindboy has that I just cannot compete with is this wonderful lilting Limerick, Ireland accent. And he's got a beautiful way of speaking and a cadence to his speak that's lovely to listen to. And I cannot compete with that, man, I don't think. Now, maybe there are parts of the world, and I will ask my European listeners to write in, and tell me if you think my flat Canadian accent is as charming as Blindboy's beautiful Limerick, Ireland one. And I don't do that very well. He is mesmerizing to listen to, man. So what you get on the Blindboy podcast is this really bright, really articulate, really in-tune cat with a great voice and a great delivery and a great cadence, talking about all sorts of weird different stuff. And I talk about a lot of weird different stuff too, but for some reason I've developed this bizarre idiom of mine. I don't talk in normal conversation like this, okay? I'm trying to be a little bit entertaining, so you kind of amplify yourself like me, if you don't know what you're doing, right? So I have this weird delivery that's developed, and I don't know where that comes from. Maybe I'm hiding parts of myself, kids. Maybe the real me's coming out here on these shows. I don't know. Blindboy has this really nice, gentle delivery, but he's a really smart guy, and so he'll be talking about psychology. He'll talk about some really compelling, weird wrinkle in history. He'll talk about politics. He'll talk about Ireland, you know. He'll talk about the strange things that are happening in Limerick. That was almost Scottish. Sorry about that, Blindboy. And it's just a really interesting show. And he has guests on sometimes, you know, and he'll talk about neuroscience, brain function, or some history thing, or some music thing. It's a really, really great show, man. There is a reason why hundreds of thousands of people follow Blindboy and his work, right? And he's just got a funny style, very deadpan, you know, very droll. And if you're looking for something to listen to beyond me and whatever I'm doing here, I highly recommend you go listen to the Blindboy podcast. You'll learn something, man. You will listen to a smart guy talk about smart things, and you will learn something. And that's pretty cool, is it not? Also been listening to the Sarah Silverman podcast. I doubt that's for everyone. Sarah's very left-leaning, as am I. You know, she's got very smart takes on a lot of social issues. And the crux of her show, it's also a solo thing, mostly. The crux of her show is people calling in on her, like, talk line. So people will leave messages on her talk line, and Sarah will talk about whatever's in the message, all right? Very interesting. She's a very, very smart lady, and she's also very, very funny. I mean, she is a professional comedian, kids. So, you know, if you're looking for something that's not me, or, you know, I've got you so hooked on podcasts that you just need more, Blindboy, go listen to Sarah Silverman. Both very intelligent, both very funny shows. You can go learn something, kids, you know? Or, you know, watch the Kardashians if you prefer. Whatever gets you through, man. I'm going to split soon. I'm going to go, but I'm going to say again, I could use your ratings, man. I could use your reviews. Now, I'm trying to make this show into a thing. I'm trying to grow this. And your ratings and your reviews definitely help the program get noticed out there amongst all the noise of the growing podcast world. So if you could do me a solid and drop me a rating, drop me a review, that would be great. Be happy to read them out here on the show. If you can share these episodes, I would greatly appreciate that. If you could just write in, let me know what you like about the show, what you think could be different, where you would like the show to go, what you'd like me to talk about. I'm all ears, man, because we are all of us smarter than one of us. You know what I'm saying? Gonna split now. Gonna hope you're enjoying your Victoria Day camping weekend here in Canada. Elsewhere around the world, hope you're holding in okay. Hope you're happy. Hope you're healthy. And hey, Elena, I'll check you later. Thank you once again, gentle listener, for taking in today's show. If you want to know more about the program, go to www.john-huff.com. That's JOHN-HUFF.com and click on podcast. You can also find the show on Facebook at The John Huff Podcast. If you're an Instagram person, you can find me at JW_Huff. If you're a Twitter person, you can find me at @JWSHuff. No matter where you listen to the show, please do me a big favor and leave a rating and review. Preferably a positive one. That's all the time we have for today, but I'll be back very soon. Until then, keep your wits about you, and remember, good things happen when you put yourself out there. Bye for now. Was in Bobcaygeon, where I saw the constellations reveal themselves one star at a time.